In the heart of the sprawling metropolis of Delphian, where towering skyscrapers hummed with the energy of intergalactic trade and vast spaceports buzzed with ships from every corner of the galaxy, a small, almost inconspicuous cafe nestled in an alleyway seemed worlds apart from the chaos outside. It was a favorite haunt for those seeking refuge from the dizzying pace of the universe, a quiet, intimate place with mismatched furniture and walls adorned with art from distant planets. But for Kira, a starship mechanic who had seen more than her fair share of interstellar combat, it was simply a peaceful escape from the mess of life. That day, as the rain pattered against the windows, she sat at her usual corner, fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The weight of her long day hung heavy on her shoulders, and for once, the familiar hum of the cafe's patrons didn't fill her with the usual sense of comfort. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door creaked open, ushering in a figure wrapped in a long, dark cloak that seemed to shimmer with the flickering lights from the outside. At first glance, Kira didn't think much of it, just another wanderer looking for a warm drink to escape the weather. But there was something about the person's presence that felt different. Magnetic. The stranger's footsteps were slow but deliberate, and as they passed by her table, Kira caught a glimpse of a face framed by raven-black hair, pale skin, and deep amber eyes that seemed to pierce through the gloom of the cafe like twin stars. The stranger paused, his eyes meeting hers for a split second before he continued toward the barista. Kira's heart skipped a beat. She could swear that the brief encounter had sparked something within her, something she couldn't quite explain. The man ordered a drink in a language Kira didn't recognize, but it was the way he said it, calm, almost deliberate, that made her curious. She wasn't the type to start a conversation with strangers, but today, something urged her to speak. Before she could even think twice about it, Kira stood up, walked over to the counter, and stood just behind him. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me," she began, surprising herself with her own boldness, "I couldn't help but notice your accent. Are you from somewhere near the Erythros Nebula?" The man turned slightly, his amber eyes now studying her, the corners of his lips lifting in a subtle smile. "You've heard of it?" he asked, his voice smooth and deep, carrying an almost musical quality. Kira shrugged, feeling a sudden surge of self-consciousness. "Not many people know about it, but I've studied a lot of planetary systems." "Your accent was just familiar." There was a pause, and then the man turned fully to face her. Kira couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to dominate the space around them, how the air seemed to crackle with an almost palpable energy. He was not just any ordinary traveler, and she could tell that now. "Interesting," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm Adrin, from the planet Silphira." He held out his hand. "And you are?" "Kira." She shook his hand, surprised at the firmness of his grip, at the jolt of electricity that seemed to hum between their palms. He studied her for a moment longer, and Kira felt a strange shiver run down her spine. There was something almost otherworldly about him. He didn't seem like a typical visitor from another planet. There was a certain intensity in the way he looked at her, a knowing glint in his eyes that unsettled her. "Well, Kira, you are far more intriguing than I initially thought. But I am afraid my arrival here has not been one of mere curiosity," Adrin said, his voice shifting ever so slightly, as if he were choosing his words carefully. Before Kira could respond, the barista slid a steaming cup of something dark and fragrant onto the counter. Adrin took it with a graceful motion and nodded his thanks. He didn't make any move to leave, though, and Kira couldn't decide if that was a good or bad thing. "I'm actually here on important business," he continued, his voice low. "But something tells me that we might have more to discuss, Kira." Her pulse quickened. There was something about the way he said her name, as if it carried a deeper meaning, one that tugged at something deep inside her, something she hadn't known she'd been searching for. The odd, inexplicable connection between them was becoming impossible to ignore. "I don't usually make a habit of involving myself in other people's business," Kira said, trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. She turned toward her table, but Adrin's voice stopped her. Maybe not, but fate often has a way of forcing us into situations we never expected. You see, Kira, where I come from, the act of sharing a kiss is not just a gesture of affection. His voice trailed off as he stepped closer, closing the space between them. Kira turned back to face him, her brow furrowing slightly. What are you talking about? Adrin's eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Where I come from, Kira, a kiss is considered a marriage proposal. Kira blinked, unsure whether she had heard him right. A marriage proposal? Adrin nodded, his expression serious. Yes. It's a sacred tradition among my people. It is a promise, a bond that ties two souls together for eternity. And when I kissed you, he paused, searching her eyes. It was not by mistake. Kira's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. What kind of person was this? Who was he really, and what kind of game was he playing? Before she could respond, Adrin leaned in, his lips brushing gently against her forehead. I know this is unexpected, he whispered, his breath warm against her skin, but I will not take back what I've done. You now carry the weight of my people's tradition, Kira. And that, whether you accept it or not, is now part of your life. Kira stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process the words that had just been spoken to her. Could it be true? Was he really from another world? Was she really bound by some cosmic agreement she had no control over? Her thoughts were a whirlwind, and she didn't know what to make of it. But one thing was certain, Adrin's presence, his words, and his kiss had altered the course of her life forever. Kira's breath caught in her throat as she stood there, staring at Adrin, who seemed utterly calm despite the weight of his words. She could feel the pulsing energy between them, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, but she couldn't wrap her mind around what had just happened. He had kissed her. And now, apparently, that meant they were, what? Engaged? Bound by some ancient custom she knew nothing about? Her hands trembled as she reached for her tea, hoping the warm liquid would ground her, but it was impossible to ignore the burning sensation on her forehead where his lips had brushed her skin. The touch had been gentle, almost reverent, and yet the significance of it was now impossible to escape. Adrin, she said, her voice unsteady, you're saying that by kissing me, you've just proposed marriage? Adrin's amber eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of something resembling regret crossed his face. In my culture, yes. It is a sacred act, Kira. A promise, a commitment that binds two souls together for life. He paused, his gaze unwavering. I didn't come here intending to. I didn't know you would be the one. But now that it has happened, it cannot be undone. Kira shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. I don't even know you, Adrin. You've just walked into my life like some stranger, and now you're telling me that a kiss makes us partners? Her voice cracked with disbelief. Adrin took a step closer, but not too close. His presence filled the space between them, commanding, yet strangely respectful. It is not just a kiss, Kira. It is an act of soul recognition. The moment our lips met, something deep within me recognized you. It's not just physical, it's deeper than that. And I know you felt it too. Kira didn't know how to respond to that. She hadn't felt anything other than shock and confusion. There was no recognition, no spark of an ancient bond. And yet, the way Adrin spoke, so earnestly, so sure of himself, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. She couldn't understand how a kiss could mean so much. She had kissed men before, for fun, for companionship, but never had she been bound to anyone in such a way. She was a mechanic, a practical woman who didn't believe in fairy tales, much less the possibility of some cosmic connection. But then why did she feel this strange pull towards Adrin? Why, when he spoke, did her heart race even though she was trying to push him away mentally? There was something magnetic about him, something that made her pulse quicken every time he looked at her. "Why me?" Kira asked, her voice soft, her confusion beginning to give way to an almost painful curiosity. "Why did it happen with me? There are plenty of women in this city. You could have gone to any one of them." Adrin's gaze deepened, and he seemed to hesitate before answering. "It was never about choice, Kira. It is fate, or destiny, or whatever you want to call it. I was drawn to you, just as you were drawn to me." He stepped even closer now, his eyes fixed on hers. "There is something special about you, Kira. I knew it the moment I saw you." Kira felt a shiver crawl down her spine at his words. She wasn't used to being looked at with such intensity, especially not by someone she barely knew. But there was no denying the sincerity in his voice, the way his eyes seemed to see through her, into a place she didn't even understand herself. "Do you really expect me to just accept this? To be married to you, without knowing anything about you?" Kira's voice was shaking now, and she quickly brushed a lock of hair out of her face in frustration. Adrin's expression softened, and for a brief moment, the cool exterior he had presented slipped, revealing something warmer, vulnerable, even. "I don't expect you to accept it right away," he said quietly. "But I can't force you. You are free to walk away, Kira. But know this, there is a bond between us, whether you want it or not." The weight of his words settled in her chest, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe around them seemed to fade away as Kira tried to make sense of the whirlwind she found herself in. Finally, she managed to speak again. "What does this mean, exactly? If we're bound, what do you want from me?" Adrin's lips quirked slightly, as though he hadn't expected her to be so direct. "In my culture, when the bond is formed, it's not just about living together or sharing a life. It's about protecting each other. It's about being united against whatever challenges we face, whether those challenges come from other forces or even from within ourselves. You and I are now connected, Kira. Whether you accept it or not, we are linked. And that means I will protect you with everything I have." Kira felt a surge of emotions, confusion, anger, disbelief, but also something else. A strange warmth in her chest. She didn't know why, but hearing him say that, hearing him speak so firmly and with such certainty, made something inside her stir. It was absurd. She couldn't just accept this. "Why now?" she asked, more softly than before. "Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you just leave?" "I could have," Adrin said, his tone softer now, almost thoughtful. "But I didn't. Because I believe that you need to understand, Kira. We are connected. And if you're to move forward, to be free of the consequences of this bond, you need to understand why it happened." Kira shook her head in frustration, her thoughts a blur. "I don't know if I can believe this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You say we're bound, but what does that even mean? What happens if I don't accept you? If I don't accept this marriage proposal?" Adrin's eyes darkened slightly, but there was no anger in them, only quiet resolve. "If you reject the bond, there will be consequences. Not just for you, but for me. For both of us. It's a bond that cannot be undone without great cost." Kira took a step back, her mind racing. There was so much she didn't understand, but one thing was clear, Adrin wasn't just some wandering alien looking for trouble. He was serious, and whatever this bond was, it was real. And if she didn't accept it, there were risks she hadn't even begun to comprehend. "What are you asking me to do, then?" Kira whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrin took another step closer, his presence overwhelming and yet strangely comforting. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions now. But I am asking you to consider what I've said. The bond is real, Kira. And so am I. The weight of his words settled between them, and Kira knew, deep down, that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. She didn't know how or why, but she felt it. There was no turning back now. The night stretched on, and Kira found herself back in her small apartment later that evening, her mind still reeling from the events at the cafe. The words Adrin had spoken echoed in her ears, replaying over and over, each time with a different twist, a new meaning. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had been irrevocably altered. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, confusion, anger, curiosity, and something else, something she couldn't quite place. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands gripping the fabric of her blanket tightly as if she could anchor herself to some semblance of normalcy. But nothing felt normal anymore. Adrin had kissed her. That kiss had changed everything, binding them in a way that defied logic. He spoke of bonds, of destiny, of protecting each other. The entire conversation felt like it came from a different reality, one she had no knowledge of, no preparation for. There were no warning signs, no guidebooks for this kind of thing. Kira had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on relying on her skills and knowledge to navigate life's challenges. But now, she felt like she was stumbling through a haze, unsure of the next step. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Kira's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? She hadn't expected anyone, especially not Adrin. He had kissed her, but did that mean he would follow her home? Was he so committed to this bond that he would try to force her to accept it? She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. To her surprise, it wasn't Adrin standing there, but someone else, a woman, tall and graceful, with silvery hair that cascaded down her back like liquid light. Her pale blue skin shimmered faintly in the dim light of the hallway, and her violet eyes held an air of quiet authority. "Can I help you?" Kira asked, her voice wary but curious. The woman smiled, a serene expression that barely hinted at anything beyond a calm demeanor. "My name is Lyra," she said, her voice smooth and melodic, like a song sung by distant stars. "I'm here to speak with you on behalf of the Hfy people." Kira blinked, taken aback. "On behalf of the Hfy people? But, how did you know where I live?" Lyra's smile didn't falter. "Adrin sent me. He thought it might be better if I spoke with you first, to help you understand things that he may not have the time to explain." Kira's mind raced. Was this another twist? Another part of the cosmic web Adrin had drawn her into? "What is it that you want from me?" she asked, her voice edged with caution. Lyra's gaze softened as she stepped closer, her presence strangely calming despite the confusion that churned inside Kira. "I'm here to help you understand the bond. The one that was formed between you and Adrin. It's complicated. But it's also very important." Kira crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "Why should I believe any of this? I barely know Adrin. I don't know anything about this culture you keep talking about. And I don't know what kind of bond you're referring to." Lyra nodded, as if she expected Kira's skepticism. "I understand your confusion. This is a lot to process. But the bond you and Adrin share is not something that can be easily dismissed. It's not just about love or marriage. It's about something far deeper, something intrinsic to your souls." Kira couldn't contain her frustration any longer. "You're telling me that a kiss binds us for life? That we're connected by some cosmic fate I had no say in? That doesn't make any sense." Lyra took a step closer, her eyes never leaving Kira's. "It might not make sense to you now, but that's because you've never experienced anything like it. Your world, your life, your understanding of reality, is very different from ours. But the bond between you and Adrin is not one that is easily broken." Kira's pulse quickened. "So, what happens if I refuse it? What happens if I reject this whole thing?" Lyra's expression grew serious. "If you refuse it, there will be consequences. For you and for Adrin. It's not just a matter of choice. The bond is sacred. Rejection would mean something very significant. Kira felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure what significant meant in this context, but the gravity in Lyra's tone made her uneasy. I don't want to be bound to someone I don't know. I don't even understand how this happened. Lyra's gaze softened, and she placed a gentle hand on Kira's shoulder, her touch unexpectedly warm. It's not about understanding, Kira. It's about accepting that some things are beyond our control. Some bonds are fated, and this one is yours. Kira took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. So, what do I do now? Just accept it? Lyra's smile returned, though it held an air of sadness. No, Kira. You don't have to accept it right now. But know this, rejecting it will only cause you pain. The bond is not something that fades or disappears. It will follow you, and it will shape the course of your life, whether you want it or not. Kira felt trapped in the moment, the walls of her small apartment closing in on her. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready for anything to change, especially not this way. And yet, in the back of her mind, something stirred, a nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had been searching for something like this all along. I need time, Kira whispered, her voice barely audible. Lyra nodded, her expression kind. You have time. But know that time is a gift Adrin cannot give you forever. The longer you wait, the more difficult it will become. The bond is like a seed, and once it starts to grow, there's no going back. Kira swallowed hard, uncertainty pooling in her stomach. What if I never want it to grow? Lyra paused, her gaze lingering on Kira's face. Then you will suffer, Kira. Not just emotionally, but physically. The bond is a part of you now. And if you reject it, you risk breaking apart. Kira felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. This was more than just a romantic proposal. This was a promise, an eternal connection that she had no control over, no ability to avoid. It was a force she couldn't see, couldn't touch, but one that had already begun to shape her fate. Lyra gave her one last look before turning to leave. Think about it, Kira. And know that you are never alone in this. Adrin is always near. The bond, it will find you. As the door clicked shut behind Lyra, Kira sank down onto her couch, her head spinning. The weight of the decision ahead of her was almost too much to bear. She wasn't ready to be tied to anyone, much less someone she barely knew. But as she sat there in the silence of her apartment, her mind began to wander, wondering just how far this cosmic bond would stretch, and whether she could ever truly break free from it. The next few days passed in a blur. Kira couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something far bigger than herself was unfolding. Every time she closed her eyes, Adrin's face flashed in her mind. She couldn't shake the sense of inevitability, something was pushing her toward him, whether she was ready for it or not. She went about her usual routine, working at the starport, fixing ships and servicing systems, her hands busy but her mind elsewhere. It was hard to focus on anything when the weight of the bond pressed down on her. And no matter how many times she tried to shake it off, the idea of rejecting the bond seemed impossible. Lyra's words echoed in her thoughts, warnings of the pain that would come if she resisted. The thought of being forever tied to someone she barely knew, someone from another world, was terrifying. Yet, there was a strange pull toward Adrin, something magnetic that Kira couldn't ignore. And despite her best efforts to keep her distance, her heart was no longer hers to control. On the fourth night since Lyra's visit, there was a soft knock on her apartment door. Kira didn't need to wonder who it was. She opened the door to find Adrin standing there, his presence filling the doorway like an imposing force. His amber eyes met hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter despite herself. The connection between them was undeniable, and it frightened her. I've been thinking about what you said, Kira said before he could speak. Her voice was firm, but inside, 1,000 conflicting emotions battled for dominance. About the bond. About us. Adrin's eyes softened, and he stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation. His mere presence seemed to take up all the space in the small apartment, as if he belonged there, as if this had all been inevitable. "I know you're struggling, Kira," he said, his voice low and comforting. "But you don't have to make any decisions tonight. I don't want to rush you. I only want you to understand that the bond is not a curse. It is a gift. A gift of protection, of unity." Kira closed the door behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to pull away, to shut him out, but something stopped her. Some part of her, something deep inside, knew that she couldn't simply ignore the bond, no matter how hard she tried. "I don't feel like this is a gift," Kira whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't feel ready. You're not from my world. This is so much. It's too much for me." Adrin took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't speak immediately, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and touched her cheek. The sensation was electric, sending a spark through her entire body. "Kira, I know this is overwhelming," he said softly. "But it's not about being ready. It's about accepting what has already been set into motion. The bond is part of us now. You and I, we are tied in ways that go beyond anything you've ever known. Our souls are connected, and that connection will only grow stronger." Kira wanted to pull back, to protest, but she couldn't. The way he spoke, so calm, so sure, there was a strange comfort in it, a peace she hadn't expected. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to take in the depth of what he was saying. "I don't want to be bound to someone like this," she admitted, her voice small. "Not without understanding why." "Why me, Adrin? Why did this happen? Why did you choose me?" Adrin's expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I didn't choose you, Kira. The bond, it chose us. And it was never about choosing. It was about recognition. You and I are connected by something older than either of us. Something that transcends this universe." Kira felt a lump form in her throat, the raw vulnerability in his voice unsettling her. "I don't understand what you're saying. How can a bond be older than us? How can this be real?" Adrin stepped back slightly, his gaze never leaving her. "The bond is not just about the here and now, Kira. It's about all the lives we've lived before this one. Our souls are tied through time, through cycles of life and death. This is not our first meeting. This is not our first time together." Kira stared at him, speechless. She had heard of people who claimed to have lived past lives, but she never truly believed in it. But Adrin's words, his eyes, there was something in the way he said them that made her feel like she was missing a piece of herself. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That we've met before? In another life?" Adrin nodded slowly. "Yes. In every life, we find each other. The bond we share is eternal. Each time we are brought together, it becomes stronger, until we are finally meant to understand it fully." Kira shook her head, trying to process the impossible things he was telling her. "How can you know this? How do you know all of this? And why me? Why this time?" Adrin stepped toward her again, his hand gently cupping her face. "I don't have all the answers, Kira. But I know that you are the key. You have always been the key to understanding the bond. I've searched for you in every life, in every world, and now I've finally found you again. This time, we will understand it. Together." Kira's chest tightened as his words settled around her. She wanted to push him away, to deny everything he was saying. But something in her heart told her to listen, to at least try to understand. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage she could muster. What happens if I can't accept it? What happens if I don't want to be bound to you, or to anyone? Adrin's eyes darkened, but there was no anger in them, only quiet resolve. Then the bond will only grow more painful. The connection will tear at you until you can no longer ignore it. It will consume you, Kira, until you realize that rejecting it is not an option. It is a part of you. A part of your soul. And it cannot be denied. Kira felt a shiver run through her, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she held his gaze, searching for some sign of doubt, something that would allow her to walk away from all of this. But there was nothing. Only certainty in his eyes. I'm scared, Adrin, Kira whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I'm scared of what this means. Of what we're supposed to be. Adrin's expression softened, and he gently stroked her cheek. You don't have to be scared, Kira. I'm here. I've always been here, and I always will be. Kira closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling the weight of his words settle in her heart. The bond was real. It was a part of her now. And as much as she wanted to fight it, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she had been waiting for it all along. The days that followed were a blur of emotions and confusion. Kira couldn't stop thinking about Adrin and the bond that now tied them together. Every time she saw him, whether in person or in her dreams, she felt that unexplainable pull toward him, a gravity that seemed to bend reality itself. But the more she thought about it, the more questions arose. What was this bond truly? Was it the result of some cosmic force beyond their control, or was it something they could shape together? Kira spent long nights sitting alone, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the impossible. The thoughts of Adrin and the bond swirled around her, like a storm that would not relent. She was afraid of what it meant, but more than that, she was afraid of how much it was already changing her. She had always been a woman of logic, of tangible facts and solid truths. But the bond defied everything she knew about the world. It felt more like a force of nature than something she could control. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Kira found herself standing in the quiet courtyard outside her apartment, staring up at the endless expanse of space. It was peaceful, calming even, but the weight of her thoughts was heavy on her shoulders. Why are you avoiding me? Adrin's voice broke the silence, and Kira turned to find him standing just a few feet away, his figure outlined against the glowing lights of the city. She hadn't heard him approach, and for a moment, she wondered if he had been standing there for a while, waiting for her to acknowledge him. There was no anger in his tone, only the same calm intensity that she had come to expect from him. I'm not avoiding you, Kira replied, her voice tight, though she couldn't quite explain why she felt so distant. I'm just trying to figure things out. Adrin studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp as if reading the very core of her. You think I have all the answers, don't you? Kira sighed and turned back to face the stars. I don't know what to think anymore. One minute, I'm questioning everything, and the next, you're there. And it all feels real. Too real. Adrin stepped closer, his presence like a steady current in the whirlwind of her thoughts. I never wanted to push you, Kira. I only wanted you to understand that this bond is not something to be feared. It's not something you have to understand right away. It's not about logic, or facts, or time. It's about something deeper, something that exists beyond what we can see. Kira turned to face him, her gaze meeting his in the dim light. But why me? Why now? He hesitated, his amber eyes searching hers for the right words. Because you are the one. You are the one who has always been a part of me, even when we were not together. I've known it from the moment I saw you. It wasn't just fate, Kira. It was destiny, and now, it's time for us to fulfill it. Kira's heart beat faster in her chest, the weight of his words settling deep inside her. She had never believed in fate. She had always prided herself on being independent, on making her own choices. But Adrin's words, they felt true. There was a part of her that believed in what he was saying, even if she couldn't fully understand it. I can't just accept this, Kira said softly. I can't just let go and let this bond control my life. I have to choose. I have to have a choice. Adrin's expression softened, and he took a step back, giving her the space she needed. You do have a choice, Kira. But know that rejecting the bond won't free you. It will only make you more entangled. It will hurt you, and I don't want that for you. Kira felt the sting of his words, the truth in them sinking deep into her soul. The bond wasn't something she could escape, it was already a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean for the life she had always known? I don't know if I'm ready for this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I can be what you need me to be. Adrin reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. You don't have to be anything, Kira. Not yet. We'll take it one step at a time. Together. Kira looked at his hand, the warmth of his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. Her heart ached, and for the first time, she let herself truly feel the bond. It wasn't just a connection, it was something deeper, something that seemed to wrap itself around her heart, pulling her closer to him. I don't know what the future holds, Kira said, her voice steady now, though there was a vulnerability in her eyes. But I know I can't do this alone. I need you, Adrin. Even if I don't understand everything, I need you. Adrin's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming and comforting all at once. You'll never be alone, Kira. Not while I'm here. As he reached out to gently cup her face, Kira felt the last of her resistance crumble. She didn't understand everything. She didn't know what the future held for them or how this bond would shape their lives. But in this moment, with him standing before her, offering her his strength and his unwavering certainty, she finally understood what she had been searching for all along. It wasn't about logic. It wasn't about control. It was about trusting something bigger than herself, something that had always been there, waiting for her to embrace it. Kira closed her eyes as Adrin's lips gently brushed against hers. The kiss wasn't urgent, but it was full of promise, full of all the things they couldn't put into words. It was a bond, a connection that went beyond what either of them had known. And in that kiss, Kira realized that no matter how much she fought it, the bond between them was a force that could never be undone. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to face whatever came next.